Altair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
At his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
The computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Well, hello there, and welcome to episode 146 of the Floppy Days Podcast for December 2024. I'm Randy Kindig, your host for this podcast. This month, I'm staying with the recent interviews theme as I continue to get the opportunity for interviews with some amazing icons from the early personal computer days. This month, that person is Dan Bricklin, co-developer of the iconic VisiCalc software that helped kickstart the sales of early personal computers like the Apple II and began the important spreadsheet software category that persists until today. I published an interview with Dan's partner in VisiCalc and in software arts, Bob Frankston, back in 2023, and now Dan adds to the story in his own words. Please note that I do plan to get back into producing episodes covering specific vintage computers. I've just had an amazing run of interview opportunities in recent months, which has reduced the time I had to do the research on computers for the podcast. Coming up in 2025 will be coverage of machines like the HP 97, the Lobo Max-80, the Dragon, and the Commodore 64. Before we go on, let's not forget to mention some of the great storefronts that support our vintage computing hobby in a big way. 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items such as video cables, power supplies, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often talk about items that I have gotten from 8-Bit Classics. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out the site. Also, ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific site to get vintage computer items. Greg really goes out of his way to maintain a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at and I've mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything ever shows out of stock, you can ping Greg through the contact form and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. And FutureVision Research, managed by my friend Brian Cox. If you're in need of a FujiNet for any of the official platforms, which currently is the Apple II, Atari 8-Bit, Coco, and Coleco Atom, Brian has what you need. He also has some soldering kits that are very cool for whatever skill level you're at, including beginner. I plan to start working my way through those soldering kits very soon. I also want to mention that there are numerous listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through patreon.com. I really appreciate all of you and helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Check it out at patreon.com/floppydays. Regarding that, I've created some tiers for paid members and have come up with some ways to reward those who are generous enough to monetarily support the Floppy Days podcast on Patreon, such as early access to videos of interviews, like being brought to you in audio form in this podcast. Visit patreon.com to see more details concerning the rewards for supporters. However, I do want to say that it's my intention to always make all content available to everyone at no cost, while at the same time providing some benefits for those generous enough to support the podcast. Please let me know your thoughts and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
I'm Dan Bricklin. I'm best known as the co-creator of VisiCalc, the first of what we now call electronic spreadsheets, where you have A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I built that. I came up with the idea and worked with my friend Bob Frankston, who did most of the coding. I came up with the idea in 1978, and in 1979 we released it to the public. And I'm talking to you on the Floppy Days Vintage Computing Podcast.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about new acquisitions and what I've been up to. In the last show, which was episode 145, I mentioned the Lobo Max-80 computer that I got from David and Teresa Welsh not long ago. I've been spending a lot of time on that machine lately, trying to get it fully set up. The Max-80 is a TRS-80 Model 1 and 3 compatible machine, not a clone, as it's completely different inside, and it has far more ports on it than either of those machines have. I also mentioned in the last show that the Tandy Discord channel and Tim Halloran in particular have been very helpful in testing and troubleshooting this machine. The Max-80 doesn't have BASIC built in, which is kind of weird, and will not boot at all without a disk drive attached. Tim Halloran loaned me, then donated a Gotek and cables configured specifically to boot the Max-80 into any of two different DOSes or CP/M. This allowed me to verify that this machine works great. The only issues with the machine appear to be, one, there's no real-time clock battery in the machine, which actually will cause multi-DOS to fail when you boot into multi-DOS. And about 10 of the keys don't work. Apparently, moisture got introduced onto the right-hand side of the keyboard. The box that it was stored in was open a bit on the right-hand side, and that caused rust to form around the key contacts and caused the contacts to fail. I purchased the appropriate battery and need to get that installed. Concerning the keyboard issues, they are Alps keys, identical to ones used in some of the other machines. So I took the machine to the last Indie Vintage Computer Club meeting, and a kind soul there desoldered the bad keys in exchange for a vintage item. We often do trading like that. I found that Ian Maverick of TRS-80 fame has enough of the keys at his store for me to fix this computer, so I'm getting those ordered. The other thing for which I spent a lot of time here was attempting to duplicate the Max-80 Gotek setup that Tim Halloran had sent me. I took another Gotek that was configured for the TRS-80 Model 4, which I was willed from my friend James Shackle, and attempted to use the cables and USB stick that Tim included with the Max-80 Gotek to see if I could get my Gotek to boot the Max-80. No luck. Even after confirming that the jumpers are set the same on my Gotek as Tim's, and after updating the firmware on my Gotek to the latest version that was on Tim's. I haven't been able to figure this out, but the donation of the working GoTex setup by Tim has reduced the imperative for me to get this working. If anyone has any ideas, I would really appreciate hearing them. Okay, next I'm going to talk about a couple of books that I've been gifted. A friend of the show, who declined to be named, recently donated the new Lee Felsenstein book, Me and My Big Ideas, Counterculture, Social Media, and the Future. Long name. Lee was a guest on the show twice, as I have both an interview with him, as well as a discussion of the history of the Osborne computer that he designed when I had a show covering the Osborne. I just received this, so I haven't had a chance to read it. According to the write-up on Amazon, the history of social media, its interaction with the personal computer world, and its possible future are the subjects of this book. This book is about ideas that led to the development of the digital world we now inhabit, and the ideas that can lead us on to being much more than livestock in an information feedlot. Sounds very interesting. Thank you very much to the anonymous donor, and I'm looking forward to reading this. I'm including a link to the book on Amazon in the show notes, and if you use my link, it will help support Floppy Days. The other book that I was gifted, this time donated by a longtime friend of the show, Tony Capolini, is Forrest Mims' newest book, Maverick Scientist, My Adventures as an Amateur Scientist. If you recall, if you're a longtime listener, Forrest was a guest of Floppy Days not long ago, and he mentioned at that time that he was working on a book and it was nearing publication. Since then, it had been published in March of 2024, although I hadn't had a chance to pick it up. As you recall, Forrest taught a lot of us about electronics in general, did a lot of work for Radio Shack, wrote a lot of books, and it's just been a really great influence for so many people. Again, this book just entered my home, so I haven't had a chance to read it. The back cover says, Maverick Scientist is an intimate portrait of a self-made scientist and shares a revelatory look inside the scientific community. In his own words, Forrest tells the story of a lifelong learner who fought the establishment and won. Thanks so much, Tony, for donating this book. It should be a fascinating read. Again, I'm including a link to the book on Amazon in the show notes, and if you use my link, it will help support Floppy Days. And finally, I want to talk about a new computer that I've acquired. Surprise, surprise. I'm a big fan of the slab top computers, as they're sometimes called, such as the Tandy Models 100 and 102. My father used one to run his business years ago, and I wrote the programs he used on it. So I've got a soft spot for him. The 100 102 were based on the same design as the NEC 8201 and were licensed by Tandy from NEC. Many of the modern upgrades for the Tandy machines also work on the 8201A. Recently, I saw a NEC PC 8201A for sale at a local auction site that I've been monitoring lately. It was listed as untested, but it included the manuals, actually 2 copies, a leather case, and 3 battery packs. I bid on it and was lucky enough to get it at a reasonable price, considering its unknown working condition. None of the rechargeable battery packs were any good, as you might expect, but I found a compatible AC adapter and the thing fired right up. I'm really happy about that, and I'm planning to get a Rex or similar upgrade for it. One good thing about computers of this type for those of us with limited display space, which is probably most of us, is that they don't take much room. I may do a podcast episode on this computer, although they don't differ a lot from the Tandy 100 102 that will be covered soon. I may just cover this machine as part of that episode since they are so similar. And that's it for new acquisitions and what I've been up to this month.
This is Bob Frankston, co-developer of the first electronic spreadsheet, VisiCalc, and you're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about news and upcoming shows. I have a couple of news items that I wanted to talk about before I move into the upcoming computer shows. The first of which, there's a new video out just recently, put out by the Vent Nerd and Brian Cox. The Vent Nerd is Steve Dietrich. I was lucky enough to meet Steve and his wife Mickey at VCF SoCal in February of 2024. And they're great people. Also met them and talked with them a bit at VCF Midwest. They came to VCF Midwest in 2024 as well. So I'm very familiar with Steve. He does great work with his Vent Nerd videos on YouTube. And FutureVision Research, Brian Cox, was also in this video. Brian is a supporter of the show, as I mentioned before. And both Steve and Brian discussed all the various platforms supported by FujiNet. So it's a great video if you're interested in FujiNet and all of the different platforms that are supported right now. And, take a look at it. I've got a link to it in the show notes. Also wanted to talk about the Priming the Pump book. I believe in the last episode, I talked about the books that David and Teresa Welsh had published called Priming the Pump, about the TRS-80 computer. And I got the remaining boxes or the remaining new copies of that book from them, and I promised them I would sell those books. So I have about 60 copies that I'm going to sell. Let me know if you're interested. These are the last remaining new copies of the book. You can't even buy them on Amazon. You can only buy the Kindle version. Let me know if you're interested in getting one of the books. I'm going to advertise these at various places, and I'm going to sell them at a reasonable price. So you can help support David and Teresa. You can help support Floppy Days by buying these books. Great book, and I certainly recommend that you get a copy. As far as upcoming shows, I'm going to talk about some of the shows in the first half of 2025, since we're at the end of 2024 right now. January 25th will be the virtual Tandy Retro Show. So this is an online show. It's sort of an online version of the Cocoa Fest and Tandy Assembly, I guess. And it covers the Tandy computers. In February will be the second VCF SoCal, February 15th through the 17th at the Hotel Farah Event Center in Orange, California. I wish I could attend again, but I don't expect that I will be going. Midwest Gaming Classic, April 4th through the 6th at the Baird Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. VCF East will be April 4th through the 6th, so that same weekend, in Wall, New Jersey. And then just a week later will be Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo, April 12th through the 13th, at the Crown Plaza Airport Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I do want to mention that I am involved in the organization of this show, but we'd love to have you come. I do have a schedule published on the Floppy Days website if you want to check out all the various shows that are coming up. And that's it for news and upcoming computer shows.
Hi, this is Kurt Bendel, co-author of Atari Inc. Business is Fun and the curator of AtariMuseum.com. You're listening to the Floppy Days Podcast.
Okay, now it's time for the Meet the Listener segment. I'm happy to report that I have a short clip here from a podcast listener for the Meet the Listeners segment this month. I'd like for you to meet Wade Ripkowski, aka Inversitaski, someone I've known for years and has always been a friend of the podcast. Thank you, Wade, for introducing yourself. And here he is.
It is. Okay, you remember how to do this. Take a deep breath, hold it, now exhale slowly, and begin.
Hi, Randy. It's Wade, or Inversitaski. As you know, but some of your listeners might not, I produced several Atari-related podcasts over the last 10 years, with the longest running being the namesake Inversitaski, which was Atari 8-bit productivity related. All of my podcasts were productivity or machine related, except for the Antic Files, which was a post-reading summary of each Antic magazine issue. I'm still doing in-depth reads of them, though not as fast, and still enjoying finding things I didn't see or know about when the issues were published. Truly a great magazine. I mention my podcast background as it is directly aligned with my interests. Sure, I play games on my classic machines, both back when they were in their heyday and now, but I was always more interested in how they could help me accomplish something, or in simpler terms, being more productive. I was always looking for better hardware or a piece of software that worked better than one that I already had. In a sense, I think we all were, but some were more focused on games than I was. This wasn't a popular mindset at copy parties, software demo parties, and while most people were swapping, or demoing games, I was looking for word processors and receiving evil eyes all around. These productivity-type titles were very infrequently found. Here's a bit of background on how it all started for me. Back in 2013, I wanted to hear about productivity software on the Atari, the stuff that I may have missed out on, and stuff that I could put to use today possibly. I was looking to podcasts so I could just listen and learn. But everything on the big digital stream was all about games. And in 2014, I finally decided that this type of content needed to become a do-it-yourself effort, and I initially set out to just blog about my findings. Then it occurred to me after enjoying the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast and talking to Ferg that maybe, just maybe, a podcast about it would work, and thus Inversitaski was born. During the podcast production, I learned more about software that I previously had, or still own, and quite a bit more about software that I didn't have. Of course, there were some turds, but there were also some fantastic standouts. Discovering those hidden gems was and is really rewarding. The podcasts I produced were a really fun endeavor and made me appreciate even more what the venerable Ataris could do, both the 8-bit, the 1632-bit STs, and even the Portfolio. If anyone has only ever looked at these machines as game machines or toys, they should take another look because they can be so much more. While I ended the podcast production for personal reasons
and put me out of a job,
my intent has been to remain active in the Atari community. Since September 2024, the end date, I have been a bit absent. I feel like I'm recharging though, albeit slowly, and want to restart some of my Atari programming projects over this winter. To that end, reading about and to a greater degree listening to podcasts about vintage software and hardware is something I enjoy. The game podcasts are interesting overall, but I tend to lose some interest once the historical and technical elements are depleted in the episodes. That's where you come in. The Floppy Days Podcast has given me many hours of education on vintage machines with bonus historical context from the people directly involved. That kind of information is invaluable and very enjoyable. I'm a little envious of some of the people you've met and interviewed. I'm just kidding, that's not a good trait.
Or is he?
I know there has been some bleed over to and from the Antic podcast, and I mention that because I like hearing about what other people are doing with their vintage equipment, and the Antic podcast is a great source for that, without having to scour the internet and or forums. It's a time saver. Yes. I think that goes back to me always wanting to find a better way to do things, or in this modern sense of retro revival, doing modern things in a retro way. Between the two podcasts you're a part of, I've learned a lot and want to personally thank you for Floppy Days and the entire crew of Antic for the Antic podcast. Keep up the great work. I hope you and all those listening have a great holiday season.
Okay, and now for the feedback section where I read emails or other communications about the podcast. And I've got one here from Tony Capolini via email. As you recall, earlier in this podcast, I mentioned that Tony gifted the book from Forrest Mims to me, and I really appreciate that. So I'm going to read his email that came along with it. I don't know how influential Radio Shack was on you in your younger years, but it had a big impact on me and how I ended up where I am today. My dad bought me the 10-in-1 electronic kit that Radio Shack sold when I was in grade school. Honestly, I didn't understand much of it then until I was much older. In high school, I went to a trade school for a half day in order to learn electrical construction. My dad had his own business as an electrician, and I would work with him in the summers. By then, I had a much better understanding of electricity and some electronics. I later bought the 100 or 150-in-1 electronic kit from Radio Shack and understood much more of it since I'd studied AC and DC at the trade school. I didn't get into computers until I went into the Navy after high school. I bought a Coco from one of the sailors on the base where I was stationed. He was upgrading to an Atari, so I bought his Coco. That was one of the best things I ever bought, as it was the beginning of my way to being a software engineer. I met so many people as a result of buying that Coco. We started a Coco Computer Club back in Pennsylvania where I grew up. When I moved to California, I then joined one of the largest Coco clubs in the country. I'm so grateful to Radio Shack for so many things. I had bought several of the engineering lab notebooks by Forrest Mims when I was in high school and had them until a few years ago. They were heavily yellowed but still readable. I had referred to them over the years for small circuits that I used at work. I want to go back and re-listen to the Floppy Days episode where you interviewed Forrest. I think that's where I first heard about his book. I miss the old Radio Shacks a lot. I used to go there quite often, sometimes just to get the free battery, which didn't last very long. There are a handful of Radio Shacks still open, but they are so very different from the ones in my younger years. They may as well not even use the name Radio Shack. I hope you enjoy reading Maverick Scientist. Forrest had the most interesting life, and I think all of us who are into retro computing can thank him for his involvement in MITs. Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate the email and, again, the book and your thoughts about Radio Shack and Forrest Mims. And now the interview with Dan Bricklin, co-developer of VisiCalc, as well as many other things. Enjoy. All right, I'm here today with Dan Bricklin, one of the developers or a co-developer of the VisiCalc software that I'm sure everyone has heard of. Hey, Dan, how are you, sir?
Doing okay. It's
good. So maybe we can just start out by having you tell us where you live today and what you're up to these days.
Okay, well, I live where I've been living for the last 40 years or so. And actually more than that but I moved to this house. I've been in this house since like 86 or something like that. And I've been living in Newton, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. Newton, Massachusetts is known for a variety of things. One is that the Fig Newton cookie that is sold was named after the city of Newton. There were other ones named after other cities around here, but the only one that has survived and is still popular is the Fig Newton, the official cookie of the city. And across the street from me, apparently the Pledge of Allegiance was written. If you believe that Francis Bellamy wrote it, he wrote it in the window that I'm looking at out of my window. We found that out years ago.
Nice. Nice. I did not know that about Fig Newton. I guess I always thought it was named after the the famous scientist.
Now, who knows what our town is named after? I haven't looked that up, but it was there. There was a baking company down, I guess in Cambridge or something, that became that Nabisco bought at some point, and I don't know what the Brookline was, but
I know it was a long time ago, but could you maybe fill us in as to what your first experience was with computers?
The first one that I remember was I visited one of my grandfathers was the editor of a small paper in Philadelphia where I lived. And I went to his office, and they were using an IBM card sorter and probably one of the old printers and stuff to do their mailing list. This was probably let's see, I was probably in like third grade or second or third grade when that happened. So that's way back in the probably in the 50s. And so that I saw that and I was really moved by it. And actually, a few years later, for a science fair project, I built a manual card sorter that you turned it, and your card would go through, and a little thing would decide whether to let it go into this bin or that bin. Because so I had seen one then, but that was electromechanical type, the early IBM. Before they were doing the heavy electronic ones. This is when you used plug boards, wire plug boards, to be able to control them. But I was always interested in it, and I wanted to build one, to build my own, but I wasn't. You had to learn how to make flip-flops, and when I tried to do that out of transistors and all that, integrated circuits were just becoming available back in then, I guess in the 60s. So I never really got to build one. But I did when I was in grade school. My cousin went to a local high school that had access to a time-sharing system. It was one of the handful of schools in the Philadelphia area that had access to computers on a terminal connected to a big computer downtown, a 70-something or other IBM computer. And that's where I first learned to program, is that he brought home the manual. I would learn that. I didn't go to that school, but after school, I would go over to that school, meet him and a friend of his, and the three of us would work on that computer, which was like an IBM Selectric, connected to a telephone line, which went to a computer downtown, and programmed in some version of Fortran or something like that. The first thing I typed spelled dimension wrong. So that was the first computers. Then the next time to get to do some computing stuff, I borrowed time on the school system of Philadelphia's computers. They had a 1401, an IBM 1401 downtown, and I would go downtown and they let me take a few minutes of time to run these programs that I typed up on punch cards down there. So that was the first, you can have it to yourself for a while computer I had was an IBM 1130. That was the summer that I turned 16. So that would have been 57, the summer of 67. And there was a course I took at the University of Pennsylvania down the hall from where ENIAC, the first real digital computer or whatever, was actually built. Down the hall from where that would be at the Moore School of the University of Pennsylvania, I took a summer course, a National Science Foundation summer course on programming. And that was it. And from then on, I was into it. Then I had all sorts of computers then from then on.
Okay. So it looks like, I took a look at some of the history that you have on your website, and it looks like one of your earliest jobs in the computer industry was with Digital Equipment Corporation, where you worked on.
Yeah, my first job actually was at MIT.
MIT?
Where I worked on the Multics project. Out of Multics came Unix and Linux and all that, the operating system. Then I went worked for there. I worked for Honeywell a little bit on the APL programming language, helping build that. And then my first job out of school was at Digital Equipment Corporation. May it rest in peace. The mini computer.
And it was interesting because it looks like you worked on a word processor for the PDP-8 while you were there, which
yep. Do you remember David Ahl of Creative?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Well, David worked for DEC.
Creative Computing.
Creative Computing. He did Creative Computing magazine. He had worked for DEC, for Digital Equipment Corporation, in the educational division, and he came up with this idea of taking a PDP-8 mini computer, which is about yay big, big, and this, and the idea of putting a rack in a desk where a file cabinet would be, and put a PDP-8 in there, and they that became a thing that DEC sold, and they would put a terminal on top of it, a video terminal on top of it, VTO5 or something, and eventually they had VT100s. The commercial group said, "Oh, we can make this into a commercial thing, and maybe we should put word processing on it." And I ended up in that group because I had been in working on computerized typesetting before that, and I knew all about text, and I had built a text editor for a device that was connected to the PDP-10. Got to work in that near the PDP-10 group, which included one or more people who had worked on the original Space War video game. So that was, which is interesting. So the PC industry sort of, overlapped, and I was product leader of a thing called the This was the ad for it. They showed you replace this with this. And you see the desk, they're 2 floppy drives. Those are 8-inch floppies. And this is a PDP-8, and that was the terminal on it, and we got that from Xerox. And this is the functional specification of it. There's my name. Jack Gilmore signed it. He was the person.
Very cool.
Jack actually wrote what is arguably the first video game ever. Back in 1951.
That's great. That's cool.
So that's how I had that experience working with very basic computers in machine language, well, in assembly language.
Okay. So next we get in, I guess, into the topic of VisiCalc, which is obviously what you're most well known for, even though you've done so many other things. Tell us about the idea for that, how that came about, and starting Software Arts with Dan Bricklin.
With Bob Frankston.
I'm sorry, Bob.
There are only 2 of us, Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston. And
with yourself.
Right, and Bricklin comes before Frankston alphabetically. So after working at DEC, I worked at a small company and made electronic cash registers, but what I really wanted to do was to go back to school to learn business. And so I applied and got into Harvard Business School, and then went there. And at the Harvard Business School, I came up with the idea for word processing with numbers. I mean, there's a whole story about it, which you can hear if you want, but basically came up with the idea of having this. Eventually, when I prototyped it, came up with the idea of a grid and 1, 2, 3 ABC, and having a formula bar and all those things that we now associate with the electronic spreadsheet. I built the prototype of that and borrowed an Apple II, which was new in those days back in the fall of 1978, and prototyped it, and then made a deal with my friend Bob Frankston that he would actually write code for this thing, and we made a deal with another person who had gone to Harvard Business School was a year ahead of me, had graduated, who was publishing software for personal computers. A company called Personal Software, and they made software for the Apple II, the TRS-80, and the Commodore PET. And we made a deal that they would publish this thing. We would make this electronic spreadsheet. which eventually became named VisiCalc. Bob wrote that in the winter of 1978-79, mainly in 1979. In the spring of 1979, wrote it. And we showed it to the public in June of 1979. And it was shipped in October of 1979 on floppy disk, copy protected, for an Apple II. And was only available on the Apple II initially, though we always planned to put it on other machines. But it took a year before we finished enough of the being able to move it to the other machines, and the other machines had floppy drives available in enough quantity that was worth selling to them. And we came out on the Commodore PET, the TRS-80, eventually the TRS-80 Model 1, 2, and 3. HP on their personal computer thingy that they sold, whatever. We licensed them the software, and they sort of made the version sort of for that. And then started putting it on others. The Atari 800, I remember that well. When we first got that, it was sort of like a prototype or whatever, and we loved that. We loved playing what was it, Star Raiders or whatever that was on that.
Yeah.
We on the Apple II, we used to play. We'd play Space Invaders. We played it so much that the fire button on our paddles broke, and we had a wire in like a commercial heavy duty button and was taped onto it, whatever, to be able to play Space Invaders. Because a lot of people, when they bought VisiCalc, to do business, but they really like to play Space Invaders.
Sure, who doesn't? Apple Invader, if you're talking about Apple Invaders, that's a really good.
No, this was Space Invaders, the one that was available back in probably early 79.
Yeah.
I don't know who it came from.
So the main reason you chose the Apple, though, to start with was because the disk drive had been
Well, yes and no.
developed.
The reason was, first of all, we worked this deal out with this publisher. We didn't own any personal computers, but they had some. They were able to lend us an Apple II. One of the people who ran that company liked Apple very much, eventually moved out of the Boston area, moved to Silicon Valley, ended up with some of the same investors and stuff like that Apple had. They and had a little bit of Apple stock even. I think they loved Apple. And the feeling that they had was that initially Apple would have floppy drives more than the others would have. As I was told, Apple had locked up a lot of the available production quantity of Sugared Associates 5-inch floppy drives. And so it was more likely you could get a floppy disk drive for an Apple II. We did run on a cassette. Our product would run on a cassette version. It was challenging, but we made sure you could run on cassette. And the others caught up fast enough. We put it on that because they said, why not do it with the Apple first? We thought it would be really quick before we'd be on something else. It turned out there were other reasons it took a while before we were able to be on the others. It wasn't just a month or two. It ended up being a year or so.
Okay.
And as Steve Jobs says, that made a big difference. If we had put it on another computer, you'd be talking to somebody else right now, he says. In a great interview he did for WGBH TV here in Boston.
There weren't a lot of choices, as you mentioned, in 77. I mean, all you had was the big three that you.
Yeah, well, 79, 78 when we made the decision. Start. It was, there were the three you could really buy. You could go into a Radio Shack store and buy Radio Shack. Commodore, I don't remember how you got it, but it was available. And there were Apple, and there were computer stores around you could buy it from.
Yeah.
Now, my friend Bob Frankston, who wrote most of the code of VisiCalc, he had worked for a company called ECD. And ECD also made a 6502 based personal computer. They were a competitor of Apple. They, sophisticated business. Their price was $654.32 or something, 65432. I mean, they just. But Bob had done programming for them initially, and he worked for them, I guess, or whatever. And they had development tools on Multics that we were able to rent and use to do 6502 development. Though I ended up writing some tools for a Prime mini computer that we bought, Bob and I bought, to do our development. Bob wrote an assembler and a linker. So we did our development on our own software development tools for most of VisiCalc, early VisiCalc development before it shipped.
So most of your development was done not on the Apple II. It was done.
Oh, none of it was done on the Apple II other than the prototyping.
Okay.
Because what development tools? I mean, I wrote the prototype was written in Floating Point Basic, I think. I don't know, it was integer, probably Floating Point Basic. And but Bob wrote it in 6502 assembly language, and there was no assembler, good assembler that would let you write a program that was, tens of K in size, So we used one of the best computers you could get at the time, the MIT Multics system. It was the same system that was being used for development of the Ada language. We rented time on it. Bob worked late at night when it was cheaper. The only other users at that time late at night were maybe a few students and the Ada development team, which was in France, I think. So they were on a different time zone. So we used heavy-duty mainframes for development. Microsoft later on, I can show you, I have a video of Bill Gates talking to John Sachs, the guy who wrote 123, and he's telling him how they use Xenix, which is a later version of Unix, which Unix came from Multics, that was running on DEC computers, probably DEC 10 computers or something, or VAXs, I don't know, whatever, that they had bought. And that's how Microsoft did their development. They used larger computers to do development. It wasn't until sort of like the IBM PC, it really wasn't that practical to do heavy duty development on, especially, even when there's, even without hard disk, whatever, to do development on your personal computer of any heavy duty, program with lots of stuff in it and all that. People did.
Do you recall what the?
But yeah.
I'm sorry. Do you recall what the initial response was? I mean, was it an immediate hit, or did it take a while?
Well, it depends on what you mean by that. When it first came out, we showed it. We showed it privately at an industry conference that cost a lot of money. One of those expensive to go to ones, run by Morgan Stanley, by Ben Rosen, guy who ended up funding and heading, being chairman of Compaq years later. Ben, at his electronics conference, it was shown privately, and we also showed it at the West Coast Computer Fair privately, and then it was announced publicly at the National Computer Conference in June of 1979. It was shipped in October of 79. And the New York Times had an article on page B1 of the New York Times, which was about the humorous, a layman's trip to the mega land of computers. It was a humorous article, and it made fun of everything. And it said, even as the believers gather, the painters are adding to the Pantheon in the sign room or something, writing VisiCalc, all hail VisiCalc, ha, 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 ha. So we had New York Times, all hail VisiCalc. That was the last time pretty much that electronic spreadsheets were, this was an important type of thing, mentioned in the popular business press for a couple of years. But we did hand out reference cards, which told you how it worked, and we demonstrated it at this conference, and there were people who got the idea that this would be useful. Most people would not understand electronic spreadsheet until you actually see it in operation. And even if they saw it in operation, they didn't get it unless it was a problem they understood. But some people could generalize. and looked at it. Those people went and bought it. So it sold, it was one of the best-selling pieces of software on the Apple II. Doesn't say very much, but eventually we could figure out how many Apple IIs were being sold through various computer stores by how many copies of VisiCalc they sold, because about every other one, about half of them were going out with VisiCalc, and the others pirated it. So it got bigger and bigger and bigger, slowly but surely. But there was no, it was no putting it on, putting it up on YouTube or something like that. You're not going to see any of those type of thing. Like today, there was no Twitter, no, whatever. And the PC publications were just coming. It was written up in Byte magazine. Our publisher, he had been one of the founder editors, and his friend was the editor of Byte magazine. And we had a nice article in there. But the article was right before we came out. And the article said, here's an example using transcendental functions, sine and cosine. We said, well, we haven't programmed sine and cosine yet. We had promised it, but we haven't had it. So I had to get a book over there that I went through and figured out how to be able to program the sine and cosine. I wrote the sine and cosine program. I learned about that book from the same person who had worked one summer at Microsoft and helped them for BASIC get theirs, I think. It wasn't like today where one TikTok video and you go from 0 to millions of copies in a day. It took a while, but anybody who bought it became the hero of their company. And because they could do in a few minutes what normally took hours or days. And so that's there were a few computer stores that got it. What we did is we made the demo floppy that was sent to each of the computer stores. They got a free floppy. One side had VisiCalc on it, and you flipped it over. It was one-sided disk, so we get two-sided, whatever. The other side had a self-running version of it where it had keyboard macros coming in and making it, telling you what it's doing, and they would put it in the window showing something happen. Some computer stores, like here in Boston and Burlington, the computer store at Burlington, they figured out, oh, you can really sell computers just by using this, by showing them this VisiCalc program. They sold more Apples than anywhere else in the country. Down in Connecticut, Southern Connecticut, near all these companies that are headquartered down in Stamford and places like that. Simerin's computer company, he learned how to demo it without demoing and basically asking people what they wanted, and sold it to all these corporations that then bought lots and lots of copies. And he sold lots. So the sales, the computer stores that understood how you sell it to a business person, because nobody but a business person would want it in those days. They did well, and the sales got better and better and better. And we put it on more and more different personal computers. IBM came to us and said, hey, we want to put it on the secret new computer we're coming out with. Came the IBM PC. We got a piece of wood with some circuit boards on it, which we kept in a locked room behind another locked room. And we converted it to run on the IBM PC, and it came out the day the IBM PC came out. It had VisiCalc on it.
Great. I was going to ask you about that, how the IBM PC version came about. So
they came to us and asked for it, and we said, sure. Now, took work. It was work to do it because it was an 8088, and we hadn't converted it to the 8088. But we modified our assembler to automatically do a lot of the conversion. That was done by my cousin David. And then the actual finishing of it was done by the guy by the name of Jeff Stevenson, who went on to work at a Sierra Online later, and now I think maybe at Microsoft working on Outlook or something. And he converted it. He was a Zen swordsman, black belt swordsman, and we told IBM, don't worry, nobody's going to come near your computer. They'll protect you. And but we got it working on the IBM PC. They told us it was like one of the least buggy things they had gotten of the early stuff. And I had that video. I don't know if you saw the video I have up on YouTube of the day the IBM PC was announced. I happened to record a home video of the staff meeting we had, reading all the material from IBM that they had sent us about this new computer and showing and whatever. And it turned out that was the only video about stuff like that of the day, and ended up in Triumph of the Nerds, that PBS special that TV program they did. But that's available on if you go to youtube.com/DanBcast, DANB, like Dan Bricklin, cast, CAST. If you go to there, you'll see that video of the IBM PC being announced.
Great. So do you recall when you started getting competition from other
the first
like 1, 2, 3, right?
No. The first 1, 2, 3 is like the 50th or something. The first one of interest, I think, that actually happened was SuperCalc. When Adam Osborne wanted a spreadsheet to bundle with his Osborne One luggable computer, and we weren't able to make a good deal with him. At least our publisher couldn't make a right deal with him. So he convinced this company that needed a name. So they took the word micros and spelled it backwards and called it Sourcem. And they developed this product called SuperCalc. And I have a picture of them showing it off on the Osborne at National Computer Conference or something. They were still working on it. They didn't have all the right features. I asked them why don't they have certain features, and they said, I don't know. And then, of course, they had those features afterwards, and they became competition. But there were a variety of others that made them until then Microsoft came in with Multiplan. But Multiplan was designed to be on as many different computers at once. It was done in a bytecode type of thing. And had a limit of 64K or whatever, and it was kind of clunky. So then the person who was the product manager at Personal Software of VisiCalc left for various reasons, was sort of had to leave there, and formed a company later named Lotus Development Corporation that developed a spreadsheet called 123. And this is a person who knew spreadsheets better than almost anybody else. The development was done by John Sachs, who had developed a spreadsheet for a mainframe product called 2020, I think. He may have worked on that. This is, we had known John before. I knew John before he worked on that and before I did VisiCalc. They did this product called 123, which was a killer product, incredible product. And it came out on the IBM PC, after the IBM PC came out, tailored to the IBM PC, machine code for it, gorgeous code, well implemented. Mitch Kapor, who ran that company, founded that company, got Ben Rosen, this guy who ran the conferences, became a venture capitalist. He was his funder. He got the editor-in-chief from McGraw-Hill of the top PC magazines to do documentation and other stuff like that, and production, and hired away from Microsoft a person to help them get it out, who was in charge of Multiplan and all that type of stuff. And they came out with this product called 123, just as the IBM PC was getting popular. And that is, if you look at Inside the Tornado, there's a book about that, about the adoption curve. The tornadoes, when the adoption curve just goes right up, it's going along, early adopters, and then 123 was right there at the time to take it, and they couldn't sell enough. They couldn't make enough copies. They sold $60 million the first year, which is an incredible amount for those days. Went public, and we're off to the races. They could read VisiCalc disks. You could take a VisiCalc disk, stick it into 123 and read it, and it would run, and then convert it over and it would run later on. So that was, let's say, the 10th, 50th spreadsheet. Later spreadsheets, eventually there was this thing called Excel. Excel could read 123 files and convert them well enough, not perfect, but well enough, so that people could actually go from VisiCalc to 123 to Excel. And we still have Excel today. for
Right.
good reasons, and not so
Right.
good reasons, but we got Excel.
So I don't know that a lot of people know, because software art is so well known for VisiCalc, that you guys had other software as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we let's see, we did TK Solver that I think may still be being sold, which was a back solving product, means you put in formulas and you could say, well, this has a value of this has a value of this, and with units and whatever, and it would look at the formulas symbolically and give you answers and stuff. So it was good for engineering and scientific products. We sold that off to Lotus at some point, along with VisiCalc, when we were sort of going under. And it's now somewhere, and I think not too many years ago, it was still being sold, may still being sold. We did a product called Spotlight, which was a thing you could, on an IBM PC, it's kind of like Sidekick, sort of killed us off, whatever, but you could, push a button, the TSR, and up would come, name, address, book, and the calendar and stuff like that. We did a product that lets you connect to MCI mail to be able to pop up a mail product on the IBM PC and be able to send and receive mail. All these things ended up at Lotus. Lotus didn't do very much with most of them, but they could have dominated mail earlier. They ended up buying a mail product. That's some of the products that we did. But VisiCalc's the best known and the most successful of them.
Sure.
But it was only around for a few years, So, I mean, it was around for like 6 years.
So talk about the acquisition by Lotus. I mean, what was the impetus for
we
selling?
were running out. We with Lotus doing really well, we realized we needed to sell the company. And we found somebody who wanted to buy us, but our publisher sued us a few days before we closed, or else we would have been a division of CompuServe. And so we didn't get any money from that. Because when you're sued, you can't do a acquisition very easily. It's a mess. So we were not doing very well. We eventually settled with our publisher they tried to do something that was like an early version of Windows, and they didn't want to pay us for spreadsheets. So it's a whole complicated mess, and they ended up going under too. But we were not making much money. And we came out with a variety of products, like some of the ones I mentioned, the pop-up one and stuff. And but we were losing money, and I ran into Mitch Kapor of Lotus, who knew go on the way to a software conference, SoftCon, which was I guess in Atlanta then or somewhere, I don't know. And he said, "How you doing?" I said, "Lousy." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah. Want to talk about it?" We got on the plane. He was flying first class, because this is before he bought his own jets. And I went up. I was in the back, but there was a seat next to him. So I went up and sat with him, and turned out they were interested in our TK Solver product. And that was a Monday. And by Friday, they had bought the major assets of our company, and gave us enough money. So we paid off enough of the bank. We never went bankrupt. Our publisher at the same time had a layoff around the same time we did. And, whatever, we ended up being able to, give Lotus the rights to it, but they never used it, VisiCalc. And Bob went to work for Lotus. I did not. I did some consulting for them, and then moved to Software Garden, which was on the other side of Newton, and now moved over here, where I developed Dan Bricklin's demo program that runs on the IBM PC. I wrote that, and then demo 2 for it. Wrote demo 2 here in this room, and that.
And that's a fascinating piece of software. So apparently, it allowed you to create demonstrations of programs before they were written. So it was
a great program. In fact, it became, it was I have an award up there, a best programming tool of 1985 or 6 or something like that. for demo 1 and then for demo 2, which was voted by the Software Publishers Association. I beat out Borland and Microsoft because what it let you do is it let you in the character-based world draw what was on the screen really easy using the keyboard with, and using the line drawing characters of the IBM PC and all, and mock up a screen and then have multiple screens that you could, as you hit each key, you could switch screens and you could simulate a running program. And it was used for everything from fighter pilot screens to UPS driver stuff, whatever, and probably a lot of the screens of software that you may see when you check into a hotel room were probably designed using Dan Bricklin's demo program, and because it could really it simulate when you press the key. And I don't know if anybody has copies of it. It does not run on today's PC because it's when last time I did a demo of it, I had to get an old PC, and luckily sort of Skype worked on it. I don't know. But that it was very popular. It was not copy protected, so it was very popular all over the place, even if not everybody bought it. But it paid for me moving into this house. And eventually I sold that off to Peter Norton. And when it was still Norton, before Norton sold off to Symantec. So so I made a little bit of money off of that. I used that to be able to develop more software over the years, and did a few startups after that for other on a variety of other early pen computing and stuff. I did software, early web software, software for developing websites, and then I have a software on the iPad. When it first came out, within a few weeks, I had my Note-Taker HD product on it. I had Note-Taker, lets you write with your finger on an iPhone, and then on the iPad you could do that. It's still being sold, so I became a pretty good, in those days, iOS developer. And then I went to work for Alpha Software Corporation. Alpha has been around for many years. On the IBM PC, they did Alpha 4, Alpha 3, Alpha 4, Alpha 5, and now they have Alpha Anywhere that does web type applications and applications that run on mobile devices, and I work on mobile device software for that to this day, mainly in JavaScript. Still programming.
Which is incredible. It's amazing.
I like doing it, and it pays some money.
Sure. So you also came out with a book, Bricklin on Technology. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think I got approached by John Wiley & Sons about doing a book, and I had been blogging since 1999. So we decided basically I would take some of my blog posts, or I wrote essays. I wrote essays and blog posts, and I took that and curated some of them, and then wrote some extra prose to go with it. Did some early podcasting. I was podcasting in the early 2000s. And I had some interesting interviews, like with Ward Cunningham, who invented the wiki, and with an vice admiral of the Navy, who learning about how the Navy used computers and stuff like that. It was really some fascinating stuff. So I did podcasting, and so I took that stuff, some transcripts of the podcast and whatever, and I did this book called Bricklin on Technology. It came out in print because I was very careful about how to use footnotes for links and whatever, and it didn't lend itself to early Kindle. And then by the time I wanted to move it to the Kindle or whatever, Wiley decided they didn't want to do that. But it is available in PDF form that you can buy today. And if enough people buy it, I get a few pennies of royalties. It's got some interesting interviews and some interesting stuff. It was about early blogging. Stuff about early blogging. It was there's some pretty cool stuff going on. So that, but it's it was my view of the world and stuff. I learned some things like, people often when they're children, they fantasize about doing something and actually do it when they're old. So when Helen Greiner was a child, she saw she saw R2-D2 in the first Star Wars and stuff, and was heartbroken, but she found out it wasn't real, Well, then she ended up being at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, I think, over at MIT, and then co-founded iRobot, which actually built real robots that actually went out in Iraq and places and actually diffused real bombs, and actually made the Roomba that she actually, I think, did the hardware for the Roomba or something like that, or the software or whatever, that actually cleans real rooms. So it's just kind of interesting how the ideas as a child, we actually make them happen as we get older.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad, depending on what books you read.
That's true. So you appeared in a couple of documentaries. You mentioned Triumph of the Nerds, and there also was one called Aardvark, 12 Weeks with Geek.
Yep.
You talked about VisiCalc, I believe, in both of those.
Yeah.
Was that all fun?
Yeah, VisiCalc was actually shown in a movie once. I think it was John Travolta, Night Shift. It was about somebody working in a morgue who at night ran a brothel or something like that and did the business.
Yeah, but that wasn't John Travolta.
No, who was it? It was I have a copy of it somewhere.
Oh, I forget the guy's name. The guy that played Fonzie.
Yeah.
Was,
not Travolta. Yeah. Oh shoot. Yeah, you can look it up.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Yeah.
I just can't think of his name.
Yeah, it was.
I know who it is.
Yeah. So he did that. He was in that. I don't know if I ever saw the movie, but I have a copy of the video cassette. And starting to be in some others. There's we're hoping there's a movie about an Excel championship coming out about students that do that. That's going to come out hopefully next year, and I appear in there a little bit. So I do interviews periodically, and sometimes they end up interesting places.
Yeah.
And there's a TED.com video where I talk about the development of VisiCalc, which is why I didn't give you the full story, more of it, because it's available there, 12 minutes on TED.com. Look up Bricklin.
Yep. I do have a couple of final questions here for you, though. So even today, spreadsheets are ubiquitous and necessary piece of software that everyone uses and knows how to use. How do you feel about the work you did on VisiCalc and the impact that you had on how computers are used?
People are still coming to interview me here. I get filmed.
That's true.
Come to my old school where there's a plaque in the room where I was saying that this dumb old student Bricklin was here and he did something great. Maybe you can do the same thing. Yeah, am I happy? It's that's that the fact that you can go from a VisiCalc disk to a 123 disk to an Excel disk, and from Excel you can read it into sheets. That's unbelievable that they teach things that I came up with the idea that people know what A1, B1, and some of this, with ranges and all these are ideas that I specified. I wrote the first versions of those and then was involved and helped design the software that first came out with it, and helped teach the people how to do it, wrote the reference card. That's like, it's just wonderful. Man, as a somebody in their 20s, I did something great, and I didn't have to worry whether I'd amount to anything. And and it was something really special. There's no way I could do any better than that. So, in terms of software development, so that took a lot of pressure off.
Yeah, you got to live the dream
But I did it early before you were making $1 gazillion. So I could do an awful lot less now and make an awful lot.
There is that. Yeah, it's a good point. So the other question I had is, you've done so many other things beyond VisiCalc. You've had a really long, distinguished career and still doing things, as you talked about. But you're best known by most people as the co-developer of VisiCalc. How do you feel about that?
Better than not being remembered. I mean, some people come up to me and say, you're the person who did demo, because it was called Dan Bricklin's demo, because I was advised by Stuart Alsop, name it with your name on it. That'll help it sell. And they said, have you ever done anything else besides demo? So to a programmer, to many programmers, demo was the one that they knew me for. And some people today may know me many doctors may know me because when they were in medical school, they used my Note Taker HD to take their notes in medical school. But most people know from VisiCalc, and there's, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 billion people who use spreadsheets every year. And, that's pretty cool. You want to, as a child of the 60s, you'd like to change the world. And it's a change. I helped change the world. I changed the way business is done. All the things they taught us in business school you're supposed to do, people can now do because they have it. So I'm happy about that. It opened up all sorts of gates to me, literally. Bill Gates, I got to know some, and I've met Steve. I've had dinner with Steve Jobs alone.
Oh, really?
Room,
well,
yes.
That's amazing.
Not necessarily, well, it's for strange reasons, but whatever. But he wasn't necessarily that happy about it, but we did. I've driven Bill in my car. He's driven me in his. We don't communicate much, but I've shaken hands with people who became president or were president and stuff like that. Because, you get all sorts of little perks with that. And,
right.
So that's cool. So I got all this extra stuff. I got to go to all sorts of great conferences and things like that I wouldn't have otherwise. I got to there are these weird things that you wonder what it's like. Okay. So I got this award from PC Magazine. Okay. And Bob and I were getting this award. So they try to make, these formal look type stuff. So I brought my tuxedo. I have this tuxedo, and I brought this tuxedo, and I'm dressed up in a tuxedo. And we shared with Bill Gates, and who was also getting some award, limo going to and I got to be in my tux, and I get to walk through the casinos in Las Vegas in a tux, just like James Bond. And guess what? Everybody else is wearing Bermuda shorts and flip-flops, and you feel I felt so out of place. And it was like, what a bring me down. Here you're living, one of the people I talked to said, you get to drive in a limo. Yeah, a limo is a big car, and who cares? I like driving cars. My best time in a limo is when the limo driver let me drive it, because it was this new, really cool Cadillac that he had. And I said, hey, can I drive it? And he said, well, there's nobody else around. You can drive it for a while. Because I like to drive. I like driving. And it was supposed to be pretty sporty. So that's, I got to experience a lot of experiences. Now, it turns out that just because you're talking to thousands of people versus talking to maybe, dozens in a room, they're both fun and interesting. And, it's not like the extra is that much better, and from what I've seen. And, but I've gotten to experience it, and I'm very happy that I got this really interesting life. I got to have billionaires come to me and thank me for making them billionaires. Because they were in the PC business.
Right. Was there anything you want to say to the Floppy Days listeners? They're all.
I don't know what to tell me who they are, why, what they like.
They're all vintage computer fans. They all, most of them have computers from the late 70s and 80s in their home. They collect them.
I have a Data General 1 right over there.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I have an old Mac SE that's back there, both of which I have a grandson who is into vintage stuff. And he has asked for that stuff. And he has actually played on those. The last person who played on the Mac, I think, was his mother when she was around his age. And he's also typed on my grandfather's typewriter that I learned from the 30s that I learned to type on. But he's into vintage stuff. He got into vintage video consoles. And when he was like 7, he was into that, or 6 or 7. And he has like everything. And he has like tube television sets, the big old, they were able to get these old big to plug them into, and, a switcher to switch them.
The old tube TVs, you mean?
Tube, like an old Sony, this thing that weighs a ton,
right,
whatever. And, some smaller ones, whatever. He likes vintage stuff. He's into vintage trains at this point and stuff. But it was really funny to have him trying out the old Mac, and he said, basically the user interface seems similar to what we're using today. And this was, from the late 80s.
Yeah.
So I understand this. When we were young, people were into old mechanical stuff like cars. In the 60s, the old Chevys, or the older cars, we had a neighbor who used to have an old Lotus, some old Lotuses, cars. And he owned a Bugatti, which I got to see, when you have to start up like this, but it was a race car from way back when. So being into vintage stuff is cool. There's nothing like going to the Computer History Museum, and going through there and seeing all that stuff and touching it, and to see how clever people have always been and appreciate what they did. And it's, and then using that as to see what can you do with the constraints of this piece of hardware? What could you do with it that we hadn't thought of today? Apple ended up, putting a mouse and a drawing program on the Apple II after they had done it on the Lisa and then the Macintosh, I think, was now we know what you need. And so that's pretty cool to be able to repurpose old stuff. People, and as a developer of old stuff, it's nice that people care about that. One thing I should say is we should thank David Reed. David Reed, he would work for us at Software Arts at one point, but he was a close friend of mine, and he actually is responsible, or partially for the slash between TCP and IP. He actually helped invent the internet, so to speak. But when he worked for us, he kept a copy that was uncopy protected of the IBM PC VisiCalc. And that's the one that I made available on my website with the help of permissions from people at IBM who ended up with the Lotus intellectual property rights. And that's why you can run today on the emulators or on real IBM PCs. If you can get that on a floppy, you can run that on an IBM PC today and see what VisiCalc was like. And you can get a copy of the reference card from my website, from bricklin.com, and actually use it as it was and see that it had things that, not all spreadsheets had afterwards. It had multiple windows, and you had synchronized scrolling, where when you moved one window, the other window would move in sync, in the direction that was parallel with. And it had locked panes and stuff like that, which you needed on a 40-column Apple II. You wanted to take advantage, you had to be able to look at a big spreadsheet, and you want to look at the sum or the final number or whatever at the same time that you're typing in somewhere else. And so you needed to, and we made that work on a product that ran in 32K bytes, including the operating system and the screen buffer. And that was a no mean feat. Why didn't VisiCalc have a help system? We wanted one. Do we have any memory for it? No way. People wanted memory for their spreadsheet. It had to be memory.
I think I have the Atari 800 version on disk, and I've got I've got the TRS-80 version on disk, but I don't know if I have the Apple version on disk.
Oh, well, you have to try to get it online. It's hard, see if anybody on eBay wants to sell it. And it's I have one, and I have an Apple II somewhere in a warehouse, so that hopefully my grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren can actually try it at some point and see what's what.
Good deal. Well, that's all the questions that I had for you, Dan. Thank you so much for your time. I will let you know when this gets published. And it's been
Good
great
luck.
talking with you.
And thank you for keeping old computers around and stuff like that. And, it's means we worked real hard back then, and people maybe will appreciate some of the stuff we did.
Right.
It's we don't want to
That's
forget.
the goal.
But yeah. So take care. I'll stop.
All right. Thank you, Dan.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. I want to give out special thanks to Dan Bricklin for being willing to come onto the podcast and talk about his work on VisiCalc and the many other things that he has done and continues to do today. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Go to floppydays.com for the full list. I would like it very much if you would provide feedback for the show, and there are many, many ways you can do that. You can do it at Apple Podcasts. You can do it on the website, via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, on Mastodon at floppydays at oldbytes.space, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays, or on Blue Sky at floppydays.psky.social, or on the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. Besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at various places such as TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye!